The streets were quiet that morning. Not the peaceful quiet of prosperity, but the uneasy stillness that follows disbelief. Markets had opened, ledgers were checked, couriers ran. Officials whispered behind wooden doors, and across the empire, from the ports of Canton to the granaries of the interior, something fundamental had failed. For centuries, China had believed itself economically invincible. Dynasties rose and fell, emperors came and went, but the system endured. The world came to China for silk, for porcelain, for tea, for silver. Foreign merchants crossed oceans, not to conquer China, but to pay it. Yet on this day, the numbers no longer made sense. Silver, the metal that underpinned the empire's entire financial system, had become scarce. Taxes could not be paid. Soldiers could not be supplied. Grain could not be purchased. Provinces stopped sending revenue to the capital not in rebellion, but because they simply could not. Officials stared at accounts that refused to balance. The emperor was told everything was under control. It wasn't. Within months, wages collapsed. Within years, rebellion followed. Within decades, the dynasty was gone. Historians would later describe this collapse as sudden, mysterious, inevitable. But it wasn't sudden, and it wasn't mysterious. It was the final snap of an economic system stretched beyond its limits by global trade, foreign demand, rigid policy, and one fatal dependency. China did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was central. This is the story of the day China's economy snapped, and how the world economy helped pull it apart. For most of its imperial history, China did not think of itself as one economy among many. It believed it was the economy. Long before Europe industrialized, China was the world's manufacturing center. Its farms fed hundreds of millions. Its workshops produced goods no other civilization could match in quality or scale. Silk, porcelain, tea were not luxuries. They were necessities for foreign elites, commodities for which the outside world would pay almost any price. And China demanded payment in one thing only: silver. This was not arrogance, it was logic. Silver was stable, divisible, portable. By the Ming Dynasty, it had become the backbone of taxation, trade, and government finance. Peasants paid taxes in silver, merchants settled accounts in silver. Officials were paid in silver. The empire ran on metal, not paper promises. As long as silver flowed in, the system worked beautifully. For centuries, it did. Japanese mines supplied early demand. Then Spanish galleons began arriving from across the Pacific, carrying silver torn from the mountains of the Americas. Much of the world's precious metal ended up in China's vaults, markets, and tax offices. This created a dangerous illusion. Chinese officials believed their economy was self-sustaining, insulated from foreign instability. After all, China exported real goods and imported only metal. What could go wrong? They did not see that their monetary system had become dependent on forces they did not control: foreign mining output, global trade routes, imperial wars thousands of miles away, and decisions made in European courts. They also did not see that silver was not just wealthy, it was liquidity. When it stopped moving, everything else would freeze. By the early Qing dynasty, China appeared prosperous on the surface. Population surged, cities expanded, trade intensified. But beneath that growth was a silent vulnerability, a rigid tax system tied to a single metal in a rapidly globalizing world. When silver became scarce, China would not merely slow down, it would seize up. China's dependence on silver would not have been fatal in a closed world, but the world was no longer closed. By the 17th and 18th centuries, China was deeply embedded in a global economic system it did not control. Silver flowed in from Japan, then from the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Manila became the hinge of world trade. Silver sailed west to east. Chinese goods flowed east to west, and for a time, everyone benefited. But silver is not infinite, and global systems are not stable. European wars began to consume enormous quantities of bullion. The Spanish crown siphoned silver to fund armies in Europe. Piracy and naval warfare disrupted shipments. Production in American mines fluctuated. Japanese exports declined. Meanwhile, Europe's appetite for Chinese goods remained relentless. China was exporting prosperity and importing fragility. Worse still, the Qing tax system was inflexible. Taxes were fixed in silver terms, regardless of local conditions. When silver was abundant, peasants could convert crops into coin. When silver tightened, that conversion became brutal. As silver grew scarcer, its value rose. That sounds beneficial until you realize what it meant in practice. A farmer owed the same amount of silver in taxes as before, but now it took far more grain, labor, or goods to obtain that silver. Tax burdens effectively increased without any official decree. Officials did not raise taxes, the market did it for them. This silent deflation crushed the rural economy. Peasants sold land, borrowed at predatory rates, fled villages, stopped paying taxes altogether, not in protest, but in desperation. Provincial officials, unable to collect silver, withheld remittances to the capital. The central government responded by demanding more. Trust eroded. Corruption flourished. Local administrations hollowed out. The economy was not collapsing in flames. It was collapsing in arithmetic. And once silver stopped circulating, China's massive economy built on motion. Conversion and exchange began to grind to a halt. An economy does not collapse the moment wealth disappears. It collapses the moment money stops moving. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this is exactly what began to happen across China. Silver still existed within the empire, but it no longer circulated freely. Households hoarded it, merchants guarded it, officials hid it, everyone feared scarce at hand. Fear froze the system. Markets that once thrived on constant exchange slowed to a crawl. Merchants struggled to settle accounts. Wages were delayed or paid in kind. Soldiers went unpaid. Grain purchases stalled. Transport networks weakened as traders refused to ship goods without reliable payment. This paralysis struck at the heart of Qing governance. The imperial state did not operate like a modern, centralized economy. It relied on a vast web of provincial administrations, local gentry, and merchant intermediaries to move resources. When silver stopped circulating, that web began to unravel. Provincial officials faced impossible choices: raise pressure on already desperate populations, or falsify reports and hope the crisis passed. Many chose the second option. The capital received reassuring numbers while the countryside hollowed out. Roads decayed, granaries emptied. Emergency relief systems designed for temporary famine, not systemic breakdown, failed under prolonged strain. At the same time, population pressure magnified the crisis. China's population had nearly tripled over the previous century. More people meant more mouths, more taxes, more dependence on smooth market function. But the economy had lost its lubricant. Money was no longer fulfilling its basic role. When famine struck, as it inevitably did, it was no longer localized. Without circulating silver, grain could not be transported efficiently from surplus regions to deficit zones. People starved, not because food did not exist, but because it could not move. This is when desperation turned into anger. Banditry increased, secret societies spread. Peasant unrest simmered beneath the surface. The economy had not merely slowed, it had lost legitimacy. And once people stop believing the system works for them, collapse is no longer an economic question. It becomes a political one. The collapse of China's economy did not come without warning. For decades, scholars, officials, and provincial administrators had been sending quiet signals, upward memorials filled with careful language, respectful phrasing, and deeply buried alarm. They spoke of silver shortages, of tax burdens rising without decree, of markets freezing, of rural misery spreading faster than the bureaucracy could respond. But the imperial system was not built to hear uncomfortable truths. At the top sat an emperor surrounded by layers of filtration. Bad news softened as it rose. Harsh realities reframed as temporary disturbances. Structural problems reduced to local incompetence. The system rewarded stability. To admit a systemic monetary failure would have meant admitting that the foundations of Qing governance were flawed. That was unthinkable. Instead, the court focused on symptoms, not causes. Corrupt officials were punished. Bandits were suppressed. Tax quotas were reiterated, not reformed. The silver problem was treated as a moral issue. The solution, therefore, was discipline, not reform. This misdiagnosis proved fatal. Some reform-minded officials proposed alternatives: partial tax payments in grain, adjustments to silver rates, limited monetary flexibility. But these ideas threatened entrenched interests and bureaucratic habits built over centuries. Change moved slowly. Reality moved faster. Meanwhile, foreign pressures intensified. European powers expanded trade, demanded concessions, and drained silver through unfavorable exchange mechanisms. Opium imports further destabilized currency flows, reversing silver inflows that had once sustained the system. The empire was bleeding metal at the exact moment it needed liquidity most. Yet even as the numbers worsened, the court clung to precedent. The belief remained that China had weathered crises before and would again, without altering its core principles. They mistook endurance for invincibility. By the time reform became unavoidable, the economy had already snapped. Economic systems can absorb hardship. They cannot survive hopelessness. By the early 19th century, large segments of China's population had reached a breaking point. Taxes remained fixed in silver. Silver remained scarce. Prices remained volatile. Wages lagged. Land ownership concentrated upward as smallholders sold plots to survive. What began as an economic crisis transformed into a social one. Peasants who could not pay taxes were no longer simply poor. They were criminals. They fled registers, abandoned villages, and joined the swelling ranks of the ungoverned. Secret societies offered protection where the state could not. Bandit groups evolved into organized movements. Rebellion was no longer ideological. It was practical. When people have nothing left to lose, rebellion becomes an economic strategy. This was the context in which massive uprisings ignited, not because people suddenly rejected the emperor, but because the imperial system no longer functioned. The state could not collect revenue efficiently. It could not feed the hungry. It could not pay its soldiers reliably. Military suppression became erratic. Units deserted. Commanders extorted civilians to fund operations. Trust between ruler and ruled collapsed. Foreign powers watched closely. A weakened China was not merely a tragedy, it was an opportunity. As internal instability spread, external pressure mounted. Unequal treaties, forced trade concessions, and military defeats further drained resources and confidence. Each loss worsened the economy. Each economic failure fed further unrest. This feedback loop proved devastating. By the time the Qing state attempted meaningful reform, it was fighting multiple wars, fiscal, social, and military simultaneously. The economy had snapped, not with a single crash, but with a series of irreversible fractures. And once those fractures formed, no amount of imperial decree could seal them. Economic collapse does not end when the crisis passes. It leaves a shadow that stretches across generations. When China's silver-based system broke, the damage could not be undone by simply restoring order. The trust that bound peasants to officials, merchants to markets, and provinces to the center had been eroded. Even when trade resumed and reforms were attempted, the old confidence never fully returned. The Qing state survived, but as a weakened shell. Revenue collection remained unstable. Military effectiveness declined. Local power holders gained autonomy as central authority faltered. Where the empire once governed through bureaucracy and legitimacy, it increasingly relied on force and compromise. This shift had lasting consequences. China entered the modern era not as a unified economic power, but as a fragmented one vulnerable to foreign manipulation, internal division, and financial dependency. Later reforms, from paper currency experiments to state-led industrialization, were shaped by a different mindset. Fear of rigidity, fear of foreign control, fear of losing monetary sovereignty again. The memory of silver scarcity haunted policy. It taught Chinese leaders a painful lesson. An economy cannot be chained to a single standard it does not control. Flexibility became survival. Control over currency became synonymous with national security. This lesson would echo centuries later in modern debates over capital flows, foreign reserves, and financial independence. The trauma of the snap lingered in institutional memory, even when the original cause had faded. Most importantly, the collapse revealed a truth often ignored in imperial history. Empires do not fall because they are conquered. They fall because their systems stop serving the people who sustain them. China's economy did not snap because it lacked resources or labor or intelligence. It snapped because a rigid structure met a changing world and refused to bend. And when an economic system refuses to bend, history applies pressure until it breaks.